Further south, the Deccan Plateau saw its share of cultures known only from archaeological remains. For example, the Jorwe culture in modern-day Maharashtra lasted for some 700 years, between 1400 and 700 BC. One peculiarity about Jorwe culture is that they seem to have been fascinated with cutting bits off people. Almost every discovered body had their feet cut off before being buried, and multiple artifacts show Jorwe gods as being headless. Archaeologists are still puzzled as to what these things mean. Although the legacy of these people isn't as obvious and their stories have been lost, they are every bit a part of the history of India as the Vedic peoples they lived alongside. The Vedic period ran for about 1,000 years until the 6th or 7th centuries BC. There's no single event that ends the Vedic period, but a combination of cultural, religious, and social factors marked a new period distinct from the one that came before. From around 700 to 600 BC, cities began to form in large numbers for the first time since the days of the Indus Valley Civilization. These cities became the centers of power for a new type of political unit, the Janapadas. Janapadas were essentially city-states or townships, and over time they were consolidated into larger Mahajanapadas, which might be considered kingdoms or even minor empires. There were 16 of these Mahajanapadas. Some of the most notable ones include Kuru, evolving from the Kuru kingdom, Vaji on the sites of modern-day Bihar, and Magadha. More importantly, these cities provided a place for new intellectual, cultural, and spiritual developments that would transform India. This period is known for the birth of several of the world's oldest and most important religions. Jainism emerged in the 6th century BC due to the actions of the ascetic monk Mahavira. Mahavira was a prince in eastern India who left his life of luxury behind at age 30 to pursue the harsh ascetic life. After 12 years of meditation and reflection, he achieved what Jains call Kevala Nena, a sort of transcendence or omniscience. In doing so, he became a Tirthankara, one who was created a way to transcend the endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth known as samsara. According to Jain tradition, he amassed some 50,000 followers before his death in the 520s BC. Jainism continued to find adherents across India and still has millions of followers today. Jains believe that Jainism has always existed in the endless cycle of time, and the first Tirthanka of the cycle, named Rishabhanatha, actually existed millions of years ago. Jainism calls for its followers to obey 5 important vows. They must always tell the truth, they must never steal, they must practice chastity if not outright celibacy, they must avoid greed and possessiveness, and last but not least, they must practice total non-violence. This non-violence ideal, known as ahimsa, symbolized by the iconic open palm, is probably the most famous part of Jainism. Jains and non-Jains have used its ideas, especially that of non-violence, to shape Indian history ever since. The second of the major religious developments was Buddhism. The Buddha, born Siddhartha Gautama, was a prince of the Shakya clan in the Himalayas, and according to Buddhist tradition, led a perfectly sheltered life for 30 years. It was only then that he stepped outside and witnessed the truth of the world. According to the story, Siddhartha first encountered an elderly man. Having been raised in the palace and never laying eyes upon old age, Siddhartha was shocked to learn that all men would grow old. Next, he encountered a sick man and learned that all men were vulnerable to disease and pain. Last, Siddhartha laid his eyes upon a dead body and learned that all men would eventually die. These experiences shattered Siddhartha's sheltered delusions and made him realize that suffering was inevitable in life. However, when he saw an ascetic monk, he learned that one could live a virtuous life and potentially escape the seemingly endless suffering of life. Siddhartha became an ascetic and embarked on a spiritual journey. He attempted several methods towards enlightenment before deciding to sit underneath a Bodhi tree in modern-day Bihar and meditate for 49 days. By doing so, the Buddha achieved nirvana, the complete elimination of desire that untethered him from the endless cycle of samsara. The Buddha spent the rest of his life traveling and preaching his philosophy. So what did the Buddha actually preach? The Four Noble Truths are the basis of the Buddhist religion. There is suffering, this suffering has a cause, this suffering has an end, and the way to teach that end is the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path is the basic rules of conduct that all Buddhists should follow. Those being right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. He called for Buddhists to walk the middle path between extreme indulgence and extreme restraint, which was much more reasonable for the average person than life as a total ascetic. Emerging from the same culture and time period, Buddhism shares much with Jain and later Hindu beliefs. The concepts of karma and reincarnation are shared among all of them, and Buddhism also shares Jainism's strict rejection of violence. Buddhism is one of the oldest continuously practiced religions and still has millions of adherents. While it would shape Indian history over the coming centuries and remains highly respected in India, over time it would migrate out of the subcontinent and almost die in its birthplace, while finding a new lease of life in East and Southeast Asia. There were 16 Mahajanapadas throughout the region. However, the centerpiece of this development was the Magadha region, which became the cradle of India's first great empires. King of Magadha, Bimbisara, started the Haryana dynasty in 454 BC after annexing the kingdom of Anga, one of the other Mahajanapadas. There were a few reasons why the Magadha region was so productive for empires. Firstly, the environment was perfect for rice agriculture. This meant large food surpluses for non-farming occupations like blacksmiths and merchants. And stable farming meant a stable tax base for local rulers. Taxes and extra food meant that Magadha could raise larger armies than their rivals. The region also had good access to iron for tools and weaponry for that army. And the area was home to elephants, which were a prominent feature of Indian warfare. Bimbisara was known as a wise and ambitious king, who had even met Prince Siddhartha before he became the Buddha, becoming one of his greatest supporters after the Buddha attained enlightenment. However, his life would drastically change as his son, Ajatashatru, would be influenced by Buddha's cousin and rival Devadatta to betray his father and become king. At around 493 BC, Bimbisara was captured in jail and assassinated by his own son for the throne. After Bimbisara's death, Ajatashatru regretted his actions, especially after learning that he had just become a father himself. He later became a follower of the Buddha and sought redemption. Ajatashatru later conquered Vaishali, Kasi, and Kosala and expanded the Haryanka dynasty. After him, his son Udyabhadra also continued his reign and developed the foundation of Pataliputra to convert it into a full-fledged city. After Udyabhadra, more rulers ruled after the Haryanka dynasty. The last ruler, Nagatasaka, took the throne after murdering his father and ruled for 24 years until 413 BC, when the people of Magadha revolted against the Haryanka dynasty's rule and Shishunaga was placed on the throne. Shishunaga, 413 BC to 395 BC, was a viceroy during the Haryankas and was the son of the ruler of Vaishali. The people chose him to rule, and he quickly recruited his son to rule Varanasi, and he himself would rule Rajagriha. Shishunaga later conquered the Avanti region of the Pradyota dynasty. He was succeeded by his son Kalashoka in 395 BC. Kalashoka continued his father's work of consolidating the kingdom and later divided the kingdom among his 10 sons. However, this was the last generation the Shishunaga dynasty would exist, as the last king, Mahanandin, was killed by his father's illegitimate son, Mahapadmananda, in the year 345 BC.